The first English king had been Alfred the Great, and he created the jury system. And that had given the English a government ruling from the bottom up. And he'd brought not only a sense of justice to the English people, but a real system of implementing it. Under Alfred the Great, each Englishman was allowed to own his own land, and they were invited to attend public meetings where the English were rallied to vote on things, especially on who would be king. The Vikings came over to conquer England, and the final battle that lost the land of the Angles to the Viking invaders was called the Battle of Essendune, and went down on the 18th of October in 1016. And England would be ruled by Scandinavians for the next 25 years. William of Normandy came over from France on the 14th of October in 1066 and conquered England, and the following centuries would be a contest between France and England in a never-ending quest to determine who was the rightful king of Normandy, and by extension, also the king of France. William had been born in the Falaise castle in France, and William would reign over England for the next 20 years, and he would produce 9 children, with 2 of his sons succeeding as kings of England for the next 48 years until 1135. The new Norman government ruled from the top down, with the king owning all the land, and he gave pieces of that land away to his friends and appointed them as barons and squires and earls, and this turned England into a feudal country infused with French nobility. William the Conqueror's Frenchmen didn't blend well with the Anglo-Saxons until England became completely cut off from the mainland of France in 1215, when the King John I was forced to sign the Magna Carta that basically said throwing someone in jail made it impossible for them to pay taxes. The French in England became separated from France because of the Magna Carta, since taxes in England could now only be imposed by a council, and not by the king, while the French king was imposing taxes however he wished and was using the French penal system to collect them, and that made the French in England side with the English, even though John I had married a Frenchwoman. John I's wife brought all her French friends over, and they married into the English nobility to the point where most state and church jobs were held by Frenchmen. And after the First Barons' War from 1215 to 1217 fought to make John I adhere to the Magna Carta, what would be left of the English nobles met again at St. Albans in 1258 to force the next English king, Henry III, to sign a new pact with the English people, and they also made his son Edward I sign it too. The new document was written by the Mad Parliament and was called the Provisions of Oxford. And while the Magna Carta had been written in medieval Latin, the Provisions would be the first government document ever written in the English language. The Provisions set up a Senate with 24 members that would help the House of Parliament, and it created a cabinet of 15 members with executive powers that could assist the king. And the Provisions curtailed the king's power of the purse and freed up the treasury to begin minting gold coins, so Parliament would have some control over protecting the integrity of the currency. Until then, the realm had traded on loyalty and feudal fidelity, and before this more liquid availability of coinage, as local peasants were killed off or chased away in the continual bad neighbor estate fighting between the nobles, the practice of hiring mercenaries became the standard, although it was a dangerous game whenever funds ran out to pay them, and often the siege of a castle was intentionally drawn out by the combatants in order to extend their pay period. The idea of the Magna Carta had come from the French, and when the first gold coins were made in England in 1257, the French were experimenting with their own Parliament of Paris in 1258, where people trained in law could dole out justice to the nobles instead of the nobility administering justice to themselves. It had all seemed like a good idea at the time, even though the Pope in Rome was calling these parliamentary proclamations just so many worthless pieces of paper. With the evolution of Parliament, the Second Barons' War erupted in 1264 and lasted for 3 years, and the Second Barons' War included the longest ever siege of a castle that kept over 1,000 people behind its walls from June of 1265 to December of 1266. And when the castle finally surrendered, the king won back his authority and threw out the provisions of Oxford, replacing them with the Statute of Marlborough, and he forced the rebellious barons to pay significantly stiff fines to the crown. The nobility in England of French origin were pushing for a House of Commons that would thwart the English nobility, and they proposed to appoint 2 knights and 2 commoners from every town for their House of Commons, and that might have worked except that the English barons took up arms against them instead, and besieging castles while recruiting men-at-arms with coin would then go on for decades in England, and estates and loyalties would change hands more often than the seasons. While castle warfare became a thriving industry in England, the Welsh became too friendly with the Scots, so Henry III took his baby son Edward I to Wales to present to them their future sovereign, and Edward I's son would be born in Wales and would be the first to be called Overlord by the Scottish Council. The term overlord had first been used way back in the days of Alfred the Great, when Alfred's son made all the Danes, Scots, Picts, Welsh, and Irish call him King of England for the very first time, and some Scots challenged Edward I's overlordship, so he took their king prisoner and put the Scots' crown jewels on display in Westminster Abbey, along with their sacred stone of Scone, and this made William Wallace vow to do battle against Edward I. William Wallace won the Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, but soon thereafter the French nobility didn't need the Scots anymore to use as their puppets in opposing the English barons, who were now being thwarted by the commoners allowed into Parliament, and because they didn't need William Wallace anymore, they had him executed in 1305, and Edward I would die 2 years later on one of his endless trips up north to fight the Scots. Edward I had improved England's Parliament by splitting it into 3 branches, the Lords, the Commons, and the clergy. And Edward's Parliament worked so well that he had also reformed the courts of law, splitting them into 3 parts, the civil court, the criminal court, and the tax court. Edward I made the crown strong by passing the law of permanent entail and adding quia emptoris, meaning that property could not be split up into smaller pieces, but would stay in a family as long as there were heirs, and when no family members remained alive, the estate would revert directly to the crown. The root word for fascism was family, and 7 years after Edward I's death in 1307, the Scots fought back again, and this time they won their independence, and they were led by Robert Bruce, who had by this time been able to think over his previous alliance with the English. Robert Bruce had captured castle after castle in Scotland until the only one still occupied by the English was Stirling Castle, and the English occupants of Stirling Castle were determined that Edward II's only child, Edward III, would become the future King of England. When Robert Bruce arrived at Stirling Castle in 1314, he was unable to force open the doors, so he set up his men in the woods at the bottom of the hill to wait for Edward II to relieve the English holed up behind the castle walls. The occupants of Stirling Castle had made a deal with Robert Bruce's younger brother, Edward Bruce, that they would wait until St. John's Day on the 24th of June for Edward II to arrive before surrendering the castle to the Scots, and Edward II and Edward Bruce were the same age, and they were both in their late 20s, and they'd spent many years engaged in skirmishes around the border between England and Scotland. Edward II was understood to be gay, and Edward Bruce never married, so the pact made between Edward Bruce and the occupants of the castle to wait until St. John's Day in 1314 had not been such a mystery, and one version of the Battle of Bannockburn was that Edward II had tried to seek shelter at Stirling Castle after the Scots had won the day, but his guards prevented it. 3 of the 5 Bruce brothers had already been executed by the English, and while waiting for relief from Edward II, the English occupants of the castle melted down all the silverware and the silver candelabras and the serving trays in order to make coins with which to pay any Scots who came to the door. The quote-unquote ill-judged pact between Edward Bruce and the English had also given those besieged within Stirling Castle the requisite time to send a written message to Edward II, who responded by marching to Scotland with anywhere from 12,000 to 100,000 soldiers, along with between 2,000 and 6,000 cavalry, so he could conquer Stirling Castle. Below the hill upon which the castle was built, Edward Bruce's older brother Robert Bruce had perhaps 6,000 or 7,000 men hiding in the woods, who promptly defeated Edward II's invading army, and the overwhelming victory made a great story to tell the Scottish children so they could remember that they were once free. The silver coins that had failed to pay off the victorious Scots were called starlings because they came from Stirling with a Scottish accent, and the Danes used the spelling of sterlings from the Old English word stir, meaning a young heifer, a word close to the Greek stereos that meant something solid or hard used in a means of exchange. The Middle English word given by the American Heritage Dictionary for the origin of the pound sterling was steorling, meaning unattested or something unbeaten or victorious, like the inhabitants of Stirling Castle had believed they could become in the striking of the coins that would buy them time until the arrival of Edward II and his army of certain salvation. As soon as Edward II was beaten and the Scots won their independence, the story of the wars of Scottish liberation highlighted the lesson that the coin was not mightier than the sword, although the British would prove them wrong 500 years later during the Napoleonic Wars, when Wellington became the greatest military genius in British history by greasing his way safely through enemy lines with gold coins brought to the peninsular battlefield by agents of the Rothschild Bank. The first coins put into any considerable circulation in England had been stamped with a small star or a starling, from the Old English word stiora or star, an unreachable, unbeatable heavenly body, and the word had the same meaning as unattested, with the word ling added, and ling was the name of the heather covering the land around Stirling Castle, from the Middle English ling with a Y, from an Old Norse word that may have come from the India Sanskrit linga, a particular feature of the Hindu god Shiva that meant a distinctive mark, although the common understanding of the word ling was the scrubland heath of which the English Isles were in no short supply, lending the perpetual nature or property of the endless heath to the popular coin of choice for doing business among the common people of England. American Heritage noted this word steorling, that was the origin of the pound sterling, had come from the same name as the bothersome English starling that had inspired the stamping of a small star on the first English coins in the first place, giving these coins the nuance of being both ubiquitous and irrepressible. And the Old English word for stirrup was the same stir for star that would primarily become the stirrup cup of alcohol given to the fox hunter after having hoisted him upon his horse. The star on England's pennies would evolve into a cross rather than a star, while the French put the Jerusalem cross on their pennies rather than an English star, and the French penny, stamped with the Jerusalem cross, was the symbol that Charlemagne had brought back from Byzantium, the cross with uniform arms, each having an end piece, that would become known as the Crusader Cross, and with a minor variant be adopted by Hitler as the swastika cross. Edward II had been named after the Saint Edward who'd been the final king of England from the house of Alfred the Great before they were conquered by William of Normandy, and the Saint Edward, otherwise known as Edward the Confessor, and Edward II's friend Edward Bruce, would be killed in battle on the 14th of October in 1318, 4 years after the Battle of Bannockburn, and he died alongside the former governor of Stirling Castle, with whom Edward Bruce had made the deal about waiting until St. John's Day. The governor of Stirling Castle had quit being a defender and turned to fight against the English instead of working for them, and Edward Bruce's body was cut into pieces that were sent to some of the others who had participated in the deal to postpone the surrender, and Edward Bruce's head was put into a box and sent to Edward II. The day Edward Bruce died on the 14th of October was the same date that William the Conqueror had come over from France less than 300 years earlier to take England by force of arms, and Edward II's father had worried that his son was not strong enough to be king, and sure enough, Edward II's wife ran away from him in 1326 and came back with an army from France to depose him. Parliament sided with the French wife and forced Edward II to sign a statement that he was unworthy to be the King of England, and he was dethroned and murdered in Berkeley Castle within the year, and Parliament declared his son Edward III to be the King of England at the age of 14, so Edward III could spend the next 40 years trying to prove by military might that he was also the King of France. 10 years later, the 100 Years' War broke out in 1337, and the English fleet destroyed the French fleet off the coast of Flanders in 1340, and the Pope egged on the war because it kept the English busy fighting the French instead of confiscating church property back in England. After sinking the French fleet, Edward III landed in France in 1346 and captured Caen in one day. And then he besieged Calais until it surrendered the following year. But the Black Death came and interfered with the war effort, and the fighting would toggle back and forth for a century without any measurable progress. The plague seemed to have come from Constantinople, where Osman's Ottoman Muslims were trying to wipe out Christianity, and when Edward III died at the age of 64 in 1377, his war with France would go on for another 76 years until it became the 100 Years' War. While the French and the English were fighting for those 116 years, the Muslims were able to overrun Constantinople in 1453, the same year the last battle of the 100 Years' War was being fought, and that battle was on French soil. The first appearance of Black Plague had been in the Middle East 30 years before the birth of Mohammed, and it had been called the Plague of Justinian and was carried from there to all the ports of the Mediterranean, killing 1/4 of the world's population. And 800 years later, the same Black Death re-emerged from the same territory that was now under Muslim rule. The second wave of the plague killed the same percentage of the population in 1347 as had the first plague of Justinian in 541, and it had gotten its name from the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian as he was struggling with the beginnings of the Great Schism. Justinian was a great leader and had completely rewritten Roman law. And he was also a prolific builder of churches, and was able to rebuild the Hagia Sophia after it burned down, and Constantinople flourished under his reign of 38 years. 7 years into Justinian's rule in 535, a volcano put so much ash into the air that it blocked out the sun and brought on a massive famine. And 7 years after that came the bubonic plague, and then there was an earthquake in 551 in Beirut, followed by a tsunami that killed over 30,000 people living in the Holy Land. Justinian survived another 14 years after that, until his death in Constantinople in 565 at the age of 83, and 4 years after Saint Justinian the Great died, Mohammed was born sometime around 570, but the date of his birth went unrecorded. While the plague of Islam spread over the Middle East, the Black Plague returned for its second wave in 1347 while Muslims were busy killing all the Christians in the Middle East, and the disease helped them in their evil work, and the plague gradually weakened Constantinople so that it fell during the 100 Years' War, and where the French failed because Burgundy and Orleans fought with each other instead of fighting with the English. The French failed because Burgundy and Orleans fought with each other instead of fighting with the English. Shakespeare's favorite, Henry V, had finally come over from England to win the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, making France agree that Henry V would become the King of France as soon as the present King of France died, provided that Henry V marry Catherine, the daughter of the King of France. They married in June of 1420 when he was 33 years old and she was 18, and Henry's brother Thomas, the Duke of Clarence, was killed in action on French soil the following spring in March of 1421, so Henry V went back over to make the French sorry, and both he and the King of France died in 1422 trying to make peace again, and the Treaty of Agincourt was moot. In 1429, Sir John Fastolf was attacked by the French while carrying a load of herrings, so it was called the Battle of Herrings, and the French lost. But a French thing happened when a 17-year-old girl from a village near Lorraine named Joan of Arc said that God had sent her to save the town of Orleans, and Joan of Arc said that God had given her a battle plan that seemed impossible, but she was given an army and managed to beat the English, which was miraculous because the French only lost 1 soldier while the English lost 5,000 men. Joan of Arc said that she was going home because her mission had been accomplished, but the French king ordered her to keep fighting and sent her back to face the English again. Joan of Arc's luck ran out, and she was captured by the Burgundians and sold to the English and burned at the stake in the public square of Rouen in 1430. And killing Joan of Arc made the French so angry that they kicked out every Englishman from France, except for those on the coast of Flanders by Calais. The French king had not tried to save Joan of Arc, which made the French even more angry, and having lost the support of his countrymen, the French king offered Normandy to the English, if only the King of England would stop calling himself the King of France. Henry V's son Henry VI refused the deal, so they called him an imbecile in 1454 and declared that the Duke of York was the protector of England. But Henry VI had married a Frenchwoman named Margaret of Anjou, who would not be so easy to depose, and the 100 Years' War would be over 8 years later, with England just barely owning Calais. The English who refused to accept peace with the French couldn't murder Henry VI right away because the idea of Henry's French wife becoming Queen of England without Henry was revolting to the English, and the Queen's only baby son Edward reminded the English of France, while the Duke of York had a peck of offspring he thought more worthy to inherit the throne, and he was making no secret about it. So Margaret of Anjou had the Duke of York overthrown, and that fired off the War of the Roses. The Duke of York's badge was a white rose, and he claimed more right to the throne than the red rose, because Edward III's second son Lionel had an only girl child who'd married and produced offspring, while the red rose was descended from the third son of Edward III, whose name was John of Gaunt, and John of Gaunt was Henry V's paternal grandfather. The white rose of York was also descended from Edmund, the fourth son of Edward III, and Edmund's eldest son, Edward II, Duke of York, had been slain at Agincourt, and Edmund's second son, Richard III, Earl of Cambridge, had a son also named Richard, who was the third Duke of York, and his son would become Edward IV at the end of the War of the Roses, because Edward III's second son's only girl child had married the third Earl of March in 1368 at the age of 13, and her son, named Roger, was the fourth Earl of March, and his son was Edmund V and final Earl of March, whose family was plotting against Henry V and Henry VI. The fifth Earl of March had been born in Ireland and was descended from Edward III's second son's only girl child, while Henry V and Henry VI were descended from the third son of Edward III, so Henry VI had banished the Duke of York to Ireland, and in the Duke of York's absence, general anarchy and corruption became the regular course of affairs while the 100 Years' War was winding down. English troops were not being paid as they were retreating out of France, and by the time Margaret of Anjou's baby Edward was born in 1453, Calais was the only part of France still in the hands of the English. The Duke of York had come back from Ireland the year before, in 1452, when he heard that Henry VI's French wife was pregnant, and the Duke of York made a fuss, but it came to nothing until something happened to Henry VI right before the baby was born that made him strange and unresponsive, perhaps poisoning, but they called it mental illness, and things went from bad to worse as the Duke of York was put in charge of the now imbecilic king. The Duke of York started a rumor that the baby Edward was a supposititious child placed in the cradle from unknown parents, or that Henry VI had not been the real father, pick your poison. And the War of the Roses was joined, beginning with the first Battle of St. Albans in May of 1455, and the imbecilic king regained his senses the following year. The English would fight a bloody civil war for the next 30 years, with both sides sharing an equal measure of suffering, and the reason it went on so long was because the two roses were pretty evenly matched. After the first 5 bloody years, the white rose, Sir John Grey, was given a crown of grass by the red roses and beheaded, and they also killed his son, and enough of the most important red roses had been killed that Margaret of Anjou went to Scotland and returned with an army of her own to join with the red roses to free her husband, Henry VI, who was being held captive by the white roses. But her army was so badly behaved that the English people rose up against her and refused to let her into London, at which point the white rose declared himself the King of England at the age of 19, and at this point the English stopped caring who was king at all, since everyone was simply sick of the fighting, and they accepted Edward IV as the king in 1461. Henry VI had been on the throne for 38 years in 1461, and he'd been the only child of Henry V, and Henry VI was the only English king to be crowned the King of France. And when his father, Henry V, had died on the 31st of August in 1422, Henry VI was only 9 months old when they crowned him the King of England. When Henry VI turned 10 years old in 1431, they crowned him the King of France in the Cathedral of the Notre Dame in Paris. And Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou in 1445, and their only child, Edward of Westminster, would die in the War of the Roses at age 17. After the White Rose, Edward IV seized the throne from Henry VI in 1461 for 9 years. The Red Roses would take it back to make Henry VI the king again for 6 months, and then Edward IV and his White Roses seized the crown a second time in April of 1471, and 2 weeks later, Edward of Westminster died on the 4th of May, and within 3 weeks, on the 21st of May, his father, Henry VI, was murdered in the Tower. Edward IV would stay on the throne this second time for another 11 years, and Edward IV would take up war with France again in 1475, which was something of a relief because at least it was different than the English fighting each other. Edward IV's war with France went better this time because the Duke of Burgundy was busy fighting with Louis XI, and Edward IV and Burgundy were friends. So Edward IV made a deal with Louis XI that the French would buy Dunkirk back from the English for 50,000 crowns per year, along with a promise to meet once a year to talk about whether the King of England was or was not also the King of France. To prove that he qualified to be the King of France, Edward IV developed a severe eating disorder that would kill him in 1483, and 6 years earlier, Edward IV's brother George had been drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, and the next brother in line had been killed in the War of the Roses in 1460, and that left Richard III the Hunchback to become king in 1483. That would be done by an act of Parliament. When Edward IV died at the age of 40 in the spring of 1483 of what could have been poisoning, his 12-year-old son became the king as Edward V for 78 days, and then suddenly he and his 9-year-old brother were arrested and sent to the Tower, and the 2 young princes disappeared before the end of the summer. And Shakespeare would blame Richard III for ordering their deaths, but without Parliament's act of titulus regius, Richard III wouldn't have dared. Because Edward IV's will had disappeared right after his death, his younger brother Richard III the Hunchback was able to foment the rumor that Edward V's real father could have been any number of different people, and the rumor was helped along by the fact that Edward V had remained an only child. Parliament wholeheartedly went along with it, and Richard III the Hunchback became king at the age of 30, and he would die 2 years later at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, where his crown was found under a hawthorn bush and was given to Henry VII, another descendant of Edward III, and when Henry VII became king, the War of the Roses was finally over. Henry VII married the daughter of Edward IV in 1486, uniting the red and the white roses for the first time, and Henry VII brought the first years of relative peace to England in over a century.